the origins of representative systems do not have a sharp date that you can establish. At a certain moment, we start representative regimes. After Glorious Revolution, it was Locke who told the story, new narration of what was happening, But the people on the ground who lived what was happening, they thought they just were establishing limits to the power of the king, that the idea that was containing the role of absolutism. They were even accepting absolutism. If you ask them, what makes the difference between France and Britain? Well, the difference that here, that's something that Montesquieu discovered 50 years later. So that's separation of power. They lived separation of power, but didn't know that it was separation of power, and this was changing radically the system and the regime. I think this is an interesting aspect, because the people who live very often don't know exactly what is happening. That's something that's happening to us too, most probably. We do not know exactly what huge changes we're going through at the moment. But what they knew is that commons and lords somehow were competing with the king. But it was a competition, a very soft competition, because there was an agreement between them. After the Glorious Revolution, there was a great agreement between the Queen and Parliament, the King and Parliament. They decided who the king was supposed to be. They decided that James II was fired, and they recruited a new king and a new queen somewhere in continental Europe, and they took him to London and crowned him. That's what happened, But most probably they didn't expect to see this system change, and they didn't expect that fact that elections and that the fact that the validating their power, the power of the representative member MPs through election, would start a competition for elections. Nobody thought it. There were, I think that 60%, even more, of the seats of the House of Commons were uncontested. So they didn't even have the idea that was a competition for power. So it started very softly. So it took until the mid-19th century, the fact that a great part of the seats at the House of Commons were uncontested. So, but it starts. And so it starts, and the people start professionalizing in this work. This is an extremely interesting aspect. So they become specialists, they become professionals. I think there are very good illustration of how this works. Trollope's novels, there is a Trollope's novel. I think it's one which was called entitled Prime Minister, maybe. And he tells the story how you go elections. It seems that people must be elected. There is no competition, but someone starts competing and working to get a seat in parliament. And this, it's just the beginning. And it goes on, and it takes, for us now, for them it took an enormous time, because they started in beginning of the 18th century, and it ended this process in mid-19th century. But for us, it's a very short time. What is 50 years? It's less my personal experience of life, after all. And so there is this competition for power. And the interesting aspect that people, instead of killing each other, instead of making real war that was before, they decided that competition could be run through elections, counting votes, through campaigning, electoral campaigning. So they started. There were the professionalizing of from the professionalization of the army. That's something that Elias That's one of the stories that is told by Elias. It becomes a professionalization, of the electoral politics, of talking in parliament, of speaking public, going public and speaking. It was professionalization of electoral advertising. And this grew until the moment the great parties entered this process, took part in this process, and became the main actors because, they were much more modern and they had a mass scale. They could mobilize millions of people and so on. We can have democratic ideals. I have democratic ideals. I think that human beings are we equal and need equal treatment, need to be respected. They must have equal dignity and so on. But what happens on the ground? What happens on the ground is rather different. That's okay, because it's an instrument of domination. At the same time, I'd say that representation is an instrument for making society. I'll try to explain what I have in mind. The fact that its representation means, or representative activity, recruiting voters and loyalized voters, in the long run. Well, it meant several things. It meant constructing social classes, for instance, and it constructed also links within people, creating links that lasted for decades. People were socially situated through representation. I'm the voter of a working class party. I'm the voter of a bourgeois party. But if I'm the voter of a working class or a bourgeois party, I'm part of the working class. I'm party of bourgeoisie. So I'm party of something. And people represented themselves. The subjectivity of people was changed by representation, in fact, what happens? There are potential conflicts within a society. There is if the Reformation happens, for instance, this creates a potential conflict between Catholics and Reformed and Protestants. It creates a potential conflict. If the Industrial Revolution starts, making of Industrial Revolution, it creates plenty of cleavages. There is a cleavage between countryside and cities. There is a cleavage between the working class and owners. And, all these cleavages are potential cleavages. They make people, of course, there is a potential cleavage in the fact that there are dominated and dominance. Within the Industrial Revolution, it's very easy to see who is dominated and who is not. It's clear. There is a condition of sufferance of the working class, of the poor class, but this is just a pretext. What is the work of representation? And we can say that representation, in a very large sense, because the representation is not made just by the struggle for electoral representation. There is a huge activity of representation. For instance, within the Industrial Revolution, the case of Industrial Revolution, made by the church. Who started taking care of the poor? It was the church first. And even in the case of in the British case, in the case of England, for instance, it was sometimes the landlords were defending the working class, opposite to the industrialists. So it's who is doing this work? Who is doing the work of representing a social group? There are cases where we have the impression, we have the idea that the group that is representing himself. Of course, no group represents himself. There must be some entrepreneur who takes the leadership of this representative activity. So we have plenty of pretexts that become texts. The text is the work of the representative. Who represents? The claim is elaborating a text, is writing a text, is putting together a text, symbols, organization in some cases, political parties, and political theory too. There is social theory, political theory. Think of the huge, extraordinary role that Marx and Engels had when they wrote the Manifesto of the Communist Party. That's when they said proletarians of all the world united. Well, this was, the move from a pretext to a text. The proletarians were proletarians and they became the Communist Party and the working class. Well, this is a basic idea of all sorts of political mobilization. Someone that takes some raw material, social relations, disease, sufferance, and so on, and transform it in a text. Well, that each text is influenced by the context. It's there is a social context, there is a political context, so there are competitors. In a Catholic country like Italy, things went totally different in a totally different way from a country which was not Catholic like Britain, in creating the working class, in representing the working class. Because the working class in Italy, the socialist leader had in mind all time long, they were competing with the priest, with the church, that the church has enormous role in the Italian society, that the Italian society was a backward society. In England, in Britain, went a totally different way for several other reasons, So this changes a lot. So a party represented is constructed not only by himself, but by itself. It's created also by its competitors, not only the surroundings, competitors. The context is the fact that if the economy is developing quickly, so you have industrial development and quick industrialization, it's easier to obtain, for instance, to negotiate with the owners, and this changes the structure and the mind of the labor movement. Things change completely. It's totally different. So this is the idea of the context. Representation in 18th and 19th century, mainly 19th and 20th century, was building stable armies of voters. So these voters should be recruited, and should stay within the party all their life long, which happened because people started, usually, they inherited from their family their political belongings. It's if we study who has been working on, for instance, with long-run interviews and asking people, you see that there is a strong, the link between generations, political links between generations are very strong because we are socialized within the family. The socialization is reinforced by the party, is reinforced by the newspapers you read, it's reinforced. So the idea was building stable arms and competing these stable arms one against the other. Loyalized voters structured society, was an element in stabilizing society. And now that there is, and so the representation of the society, the main change in representation is making society, it's represented the society as a liquid society. So it's, I think this is the damaging effect, or damaging. Someone might be saying that's a positive fact that society is liquid, that there are not long-run loyalties, that people can change mind, they can choose when they want, what they want, how they prefer. But it's not exactly like this. It's a tiny minority which is doing like this. It's being this. So this is the effect. This is part of the fact that the media there is the eruption of the media within political systems and within political discourse. So it's the media. You don't, in creating loyalized followers was a lot of work, a huge work.
Yeah.
In the Italian experience, there was a huge amount of time, a huge number of professionals who took care of this, activists, militants, professionals, and so on, who were working at that. Well, the idea that the media go on TV and you persuade people with a speech or with a brilliant idea that circulates through Facebook or Instagram or one of these social media, it changes. Media are extremely expensive, this is sure, but it's much more expensive to have to manage an industry as it happened. Big firm which organizing voting activity, campaigning, and so on.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I was thinking as you were speaking about the distinction between occasional versus opportunistic representative claim, as Dario would suggest, but in some ways I can see in your work that representation has always had an opportunistic element insofar as it has to speak to the context and the pretext that provides the opportunity for claim making, but the occasional representation feels very much more a moment and then it's gone, and then another moment, whereas the opportunism can be built into that work of representation, as you say. It's but I was also thinking that the idea of representation as work over time, as a project that involves, it has a material basis, needs organization. It's not just about speaking, it's about mobilizing in ways, mobilizing bodies to do things. That's a very interesting way of thinking of representation. I mean, it speaks to an element of representation that's sometimes left out of some of the uses that are made of the representative claim making, which seems to be just all about speaking. You make a claim. So in some ways, the representative claim making actually captures something about what you call occasional
Short-termism. It's short-term representation. It changes all time long. Short-term. One day you say something, one other day you say something other. One day you build your text some way, and the other day you build some totally different.
And yet I wonder if there is still a project in the background behind all of this, isn't there, in terms of the emergence of the populist parties also are linked into transnational networks, very deliberate tactics. The uses of the rhetoric of the people is not just someone just has the idea, it's built into a project that's taking work by people linked between with strong hard right agenda, often, even if it is around economic protectionism or something. So perhaps we need to be a little bit cautious on what presents itself as occasional representation might actually be linked into a longer project. Yeah,
this is well, among the other things that I've been doing this year since I published this book, I wrote a chapter where I said that Lipset and Rocken forgot a cleavage. I said that's the forgotten cleavage. That's the cleavage between, let's say, humanism, enlightenment, modernity, and traditional thinking or reaction. So there is this link because, well, all our societies have this strong division between a modernist part and a traditionalist part, with its theory, its professionals, its intellectuals, its books, its journals. It's a very strong structure within our societies that we have forgotten for several reasons, because, well, the great success of post-war development, the welfare state, it seemed that everything went well, that the idea of progress and so on. But at a certain moment, these networks started to mobilize. We think the personality of some of these leaders, take the case of Jean-Marie Le Pen. Jean-Marie Le Pen was he came from extreme right to an extreme right family. He came from Brittany with his region, extreme right, as a strong tradition of the religious extreme right. He was a private in Algeria. He fought in Algeria. He admitted that he participated to torture and so on. He was a nostalgic of the Vichy regime. He was anti-Semitic. He had all the features of a reaction. And the same if we consider, well, in Italy now we have a prime minister who comes from a really fascist party, that's it's clear the ascendancy of this party. Well, all this, but this has, was not visible, had disappeared, these networks. At a certain moment when there was the big crisis of Western industrial system, productive system, the move from Fordism to post-Fordism was an extraordinary move and so on. When some started building cars as well as as good as we did in Europe, or started building washing machines, or of course computers, electronics, and so on. So it was a collapse of the European productive system. And so it has been a crisis. These last 50 years have been years of sufferance for the working class for sure, but a great part of the middle class. So, well, they came, they reappeared, they said, we are here. And how did they reappear? They didn't say we are nativists or nationalists or we are fascists, because fascism doesn't come back. Fascism was a military organization. They are not. But these networks are part-oriented. And what was their advantage? What was their, their great resource? They had been out of the system. Nobody knew them. They were totally new. And they could start build their representative claims in a totally different way, with a totally different style. Well, the style of traditional parties, let's say, was based on politeness, let's say. Party has to be polite each other, respect each other. The fact that sometimes in parliament, in the Italian parliament, something happened that, the communists and Christian Democrats, they have moments of sharp conflict in parliament. But at a certain moment, this was strongly disapproved. There was a general disapproval for this. And the chair, the speaker of the house could invited everybody to keep calm, to behave correctly, and so on. Since the 80s, these people make their eruption in the electorate. Since they started doing all the things, they poisoned the political language. That's the fact. And this poisoned the political discussion, the way of insulting each other. Well, they could do it because they came from somewhere else. Nobody had ever seen them. They had no constraints coming from tradition, from their past, for the habits for relations with other parties, of course, because parties stay following for years. Of course, even if they belong to different parties, the opposition is well, in case of Britain, it's Her Majesty's opposition, His Majesty's opposition. That's the idea. It's the opposition is with. It's not something else. They came from the outside. They came from somewhere else. And so the fact they could use opportunistic representation or occasional representation, for them it was easier than for other parties.
And that's very interesting, and that may be a good way to end our conversation, because you've kind of come around full circle from talking about the representative regime, as you say, as another stage in the civilization of customs, to this moment in which politeness is well, I guess the politeness provides, would you say, some of the context in which they can make their claim making to distinguish themselves, but it's a challenge to the representative system
a strong concept to this is the parliamentary civilization.
Mhm.
Because what is the principle of parliamentary civilization? That we speak each other.
Mm.
That we talk, we discuss, we persuade each other. We think that the other is in good faith.
Mhm.
This is a civility principle. Well, with these parties, these rules don't work anymore. They aren't anymore accepted. They play a different game. And of course, they could use the opportunities offered by the media to change style much more easily than other parties. They came from the outside. They were free. They were, well, history is made also of these things.